All right, I will keep putting this up here. This is where you can find the videos, including others that you, from other cruises, if you're interested in that, or other kinds of courses that I've taught. But today we're going to talk about the children of Abraham. As we've gotten into this, because I'm talking about a lot of different topics that intersect to this region of the world, then some of the things that I'm going to, the slides and some of the things I have to say are going to be duplicates, because they have to be. All of these things sort of intersect at one point. So I've shown you this slide already. More than half of the population of the planet are members of one of the three great monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in that order, historically in that order. All three of them are called Abrahamic religions because a man who lived 4,000 or so years ago, Abraham, who started out being called Abram, which meant exalted father, his name was changed to Abraham, which means father of many, which reflected the fact that God had promised him that he would be the father of a great nation. And again, all three of the great faiths, monotheistic faiths, whether it be in Hebrew, here, in Arabic, or in English. Now, obviously there are Christians that don't speak English, but look back to Abraham as being the source, the founder, original founder of their religion. And so Father Abraham is a reference that you will hear in all three of the monotheistic religions. It comes from this passage in Genesis, and I mentioned yesterday the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Genesis, the first book of the Hebrew Bible, and the first 11 chapters are what's called the prehistoric prologue, and there are four great events in the prehistoric prologue: the act of creation, the fall in the Garden of Eden, the flood with Noah, and the Tower of Babel. At the end of the 11th chapter, at the end of the prehistoric prologue, Abraham is introduced. And then the whole rest of the book of Genesis, from the start of chapter 12 on, is about Abraham and his descendants and really the creation of the Hebrew people. So in Genesis 12, 1 to 5, we read this. The Lord had said to Abram, remember he hasn't had his name changed to Abraham yet, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So the promises to Abraham, there actually are threefold promises. The ones that are reflected here is the fact that he would, that God would make of him a great nation. Actually, that comes in the next passage. But that through him, all the peoples of the earth would be blessed. And then in chapter 15, there's a restatement of the promise from God to Abraham. It says, he took him outside and said, look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land and to take possession of it. So the promises are that he would be the father of a great nation, and Abraham is seen as the father not only of the Hebrew people, that is the Jewish people, but also of all the Arabic peoples. And so all of those who are Semites in the world today, Semitic peoples, are all descended from him. He also was promised there would be a land that they could call their own. That's where we get the idea of the promised land of Israel. And that through him all peoples of the earth would be blessed. This is the map, similar to what we've been looking at. Of course, here's a photograph of Abraham standing right in the middle. Ur of the Chaldees. This area down here, you'll notice Babylon, Ur, Eridu, Uruk, some of the oldest cities in the world. They form the Sumerian or Chaldean area of where we believe civilization really began. And we're told that Abraham was from the city of Ur, that he traveled north. If you read the stories in Genesis to Haran, where his father Terah died, he then traveled down through Canaan, what would become the promised land, into Egypt, sojourned in Egypt for a while, and then came back to this area. So this is the path of Abraham's life, right here. Egypt is involved in it. Obviously Canaan, what we know of as Israel today, or that area, and all Babylonia, Sumer, all of that is part of this story. So you can see how this intersects with a lot of the things we've been talking about in the lecture so far. I've shown you this chart where Abraham, through his wife Sarah, bore a son Isaac, and they were over 80 years old at this point. So that's why they, in fact, at one point, When God tells them they will have a son, Sarah is overhearing this. She laughs because she thought, like, that's going to happen. Okay, but Scripture says that she did bear a son, Isaac, who had a son named Jacob, actually two sons, Jacob and Esau. Later, Jacob's name also was changed to Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, and then eventually down to Jesus. As we said yesterday, through the handmaiden of Sarah, Hagar acted as a surrogate in order to bear a child to Abraham. He was Ishmael, actually the first child of Abraham. From him came the 12 tribes of Ishmael, who are all the Arabic peoples, plus some, and then eventually to Muhammad. So these images give you some of the key pieces from the story of Abraham. And it's interesting that in the Hebrew Bible, which is also part of the Christian Bible, we call it the Old Testament and New Testament. The Old Testament is the same as the Hebrew Bible, but in a different order and with a different number of books. But it's all the same content because the Hebrew Bible organizes it differently. It doesn't have 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Each of those is one book. Ezra and Nehemiah is one book. And all of the minor prophets are put together in one book in the Hebrew Bible called the Book of the 12. So in those books, we have the stories of where Hagar and her son Ishmael are being sent out because of jealousy by Sarah, who feels like Ishmael might try to claim to be the heir to Abraham. So they are sent away, and God promises He'll take care of them. Interestingly enough, the Islamic version in the Quran of this story then focuses on Ishmael and all of the activities that Muslim people do during the Hajj in Mecca, like drinking from the Zamzam well. That's because the well of Zamzam, because Hagar and her son Ishmael thought they were going to die from thirst until God miraculously revealed this well to Hagar. They run back and forth between two hills representing the flight of Hagar and her son Ishmael. There are all of the various things they do are related to Hagar and Ishmael because the Muslim faith focuses on them rather than on Isaac. So it's Abraham, Hagar, and Ishmael are much more the focus in the Islamic faith than Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac. And the stories often parallel one another. For instance, if you remember your Sunday school days, both of these images represent the fact that God, in the Hebrew Bible, tells Abraham, take Isaac, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Talk about rubbing salt in the wound. Take him to the place I will show you and sacrifice him to me. Well, Abraham, I'm sure somewhat reluctantly, we don't have his feelings about it recorded, but he does exactly that. He takes them to Mount Moriah. He takes his son to Mount Moriah, and Isaac says along the way, we have wood, we have fire, but where's the lamb that we're going to sacrifice? And Abraham says God will provide the sacrificial, for the sacrifice. Well, the interesting thing is, of course, Abraham starts to sacrifice Isaac, and as he raises his hand with a knife, angel of the Lord stops him and says, do not harm this child. He was trying to prove Abraham's faith. And in the background, in fact, this picture, I think you can see it over here, there's a ram that's caught in the brush, and they end up sacrificing the ram rather than Isaac. I tell you all of that because in the Muslim version of it, in the Quran, it's Ishmael that is almost sacrificed, not Isaac. So there are clear parallels through all of this, all of them related to Abraham. The story in the Quran is that Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba, that square thing in Mecca, that they cleared it of all the idols that were in it. Later on, those idols were replaced. And then later when Muhammad comes along, he repeated that clearing of the idols out of the Kaaba. So you see the sort of interweaving of these stories in Hebrew, the Christian, and the Muslim versions of it. Key dates, again, 3200 civilization begins. Anywhere from 4500 to 3200 you may see is the beginning of civilization. By that we don't mean that human society. We mean civilization in the sense of cultivated crops, domesticated animals, irrigation, writing, organized religion, and particularly cities. Cities are the primary thing that represent human civilization. 3200 is a pretty good reference date. That's when the Sumerians really started. That's really the start of the Egyptian dynastic periods, or pre-dynastic period. In around 2091 BC, Abram obeys God and follows him. We just read that passage. We say circa. Circa means as best we know, about. Then Judaism, we'll look at the three of these. In 1446 BC, about, Moses is called. He leads the Exodus from Egypt. He receives the law of Mount Sinai, and he begins the Jewish faith. Abraham was responsible for was the father of the Hebrew people. Moses was given the law and therefore is the father of the Jewish faith. And then 1406 or so BC, the Israelites enter the Promised Land. Again, remember that was part of the first promise that Abraham got, is that he would have a place for his people to live. Around 1010 BC, King David is the second king of united Israel, but he is really the great king. He's the one that really establishes them as a nation. And then in 996, Solomon begins building the temple. The three great characters in the Jewish history, in the Hebrew history, are Abraham, Father Abraham, who started the Hebrew people. Secondly, Moses, who was given the law and therefore is the founder of the Jewish faith. Between Abraham and Moses, there's about a 500-year period in which there was no organized religion. They were just told to be obedient to God and follow him. There was no law between Abraham and Moses. It didn't come for 500 years after Abraham. And then the third important character in the Jewish history is David, the great king, the one that they have always referred back to as being the one who organized the nation of Israel. So the people of Israel, Abraham. The religion, the Jewish religion, Moses. The nation, the political nation of Israel, David. Those are the three great characters in the history of the Jewish people. Christianity, sometime around between 4 and 6, we believe, BC, the original listing, you know, when they changed the calendars and started all over again with 0 in terms of AD, they got it wrong, we believe now, by 4 to 6 years. So we believe Jesus, who was Jewish, was born in Bethlehem around between 4 and 6 BC. At 24 AD, he begins his ministry in Israel. Around 27 AD, some people say from between 24 and 30 he began his ministry. Sometime around 27 to 33 he is crucified, but his followers say he was physically resurrected from the dead. He ascended into heaven, and Christianity then struggled for 300 years not being legal. And one of the big reasons they were not legal is that they, unlike most of the other religions that we've talked about in the ancient Near East, Christians refused to worship any other gods, and they refused to do sacrifices to the emperors, the Roman emperors who were seen as gods. And because of that, they were seriously persecuted. They were accused of all kinds of things. For instance, they heard that these Christians would get together and they would eat the body and drink the blood of their founder. Communion, right? You know about the sacrament of communion. Well, people thought that meant they were cannibals. They would get together and have a love feast, which is described, the agape meal, where they would get together and fellowship with one another and eat a meal together. Love feast was interpreted as being some sort of erotic orgy. And so all of these rumors about how horrible the Christians were early on led to their persecution, but especially because they would not sacrifice to the Roman emperors. Then in 321, Constantine takes over all of the Roman Empire. He sets up the capital in what we know of as Istanbul. It was called Constantinople. He called it New Rome, and he legalizes Christianity. The story there is that when he was getting ready to go into battle against Maxentius, the last of his competitors to be the emperor of the Roman Empire, at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Maxentius had a much bigger army, and it looked as though Constantine was not going to be successful here. But the night before, he had a dream or a vision that he saw the Chi Rho. Chi Rho, it looks like a P with an X through it. You see that sometimes in churches. Chi Rho are the first two letters of the word Christos, Christ. And so that's always been a Christian symbol. It was a Christian symbol in the early 300s. Well, when he saw this symbol in his dream or vision, the Chi Rho in the sky, he heard what he believed to be the voice of God say, "In this symbol, be victorious." And so the story goes that the next day, before they went into battle, he had all of his soldiers paint the Chi Rho on their shields. He defeated Maxentius, at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. He credited it as being because of the Christian symbolism and his faith, and so he converted to Christianity. He actually didn't get baptized, which technically is how you got converted to Christianity. He didn't get baptized until he was on his deathbed. But he supported Christianity during all the time he was ruling. So, 321, Constantine legalizes Christianity. We then jump forward just over from Constantine, 250 years, to Muhammad, born in Mecca. In 610, he receives the revelation of the Quran, or begins to receive the revelation. 622, in the Hijra, the migration from Mecca up to Medina, what was called Yathrib, and then it later became named Medina, the city. That was when they began the calendar, and Islam officially started. And then in 632, he dies, and he is followed by the various caliphs that we talked about yesterday, the various dynasties that grew the Islamic faith around the world. Let's talk about these a little bit more detail one at a time. Judaism. Judaism is the oldest monotheistic belief system. I talked when we were talking about Egypt, Akhenaten, who had been Amenhotep IV, decided there was only going to be one God, the god Aten, who was the disk of the sun, and so he moved his capital to Amarna. He created worship for only one god, Akhenaten, so he is credited with being a monotheist. And then after he died, they wiped all that away and went back to polytheism. But he actually came almost 700 years after Abraham, which is the start of the Judaic faith and the Jewish monotheism. So the very first monotheistic religion was Judaism. In the total world population today, and these numbers, you know, I haven't updated these in the last couple of years, and they're probably different now. Total world population, it's not like they count them every year. Total world population, the time I did this, and the relationships are still the same, about 7.3 billion. Of that, Christianity is the largest religion in the world, 2.2 or 2.3 billion. Muslim, or the Islamic faith, is second, 1.6 to 1.9 billion, depending upon which count you look at. Then, in terms of size, Hindus, 1.1 billion, Buddhists, 488 million, Sikhs, we'll talk, if you're on, continue on to Singapore, I'll do a talk about the Sikhs, 28 million. Just in Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country in the world, we have in excess of 205 million Muslims. In the United States, there are 16 million Southern Baptists. Do we have any Baptists in the group? Good for you. I was a Baptist once. I also was an Anglican once, but and then finally found Reformed theology and became a Presbyterian. So the total number of Jews worldwide is 14 million, meaning there are fewer Jews in the world than there are Southern Baptists in the United States. There are only 0.2% of the world population are Jewish, and it was only 2 years ago that more than half of the Jewish people in the world were in Israel, because of the principle of Aliyah, that you can, the right of return for Jews to be able to go back to Israel and become citizens there. Because of all of that, there now are more than half of the Jews in the world are in Israel. For a long, long time, there were more Jews in New York City than there were in Israel. Okay? And so there are only 0.2% of the world's population. Despite that, and I mentioned this the other day, Jews have received more than 22% of all Nobel Prizes. They're 0.2% of the world's population, but they've gotten more than 22% of all the world's Nobel Prizes, and they are major forces in entertainment, medicine, law, and on and on. They are an extraordinary force, and we need to give thanks to God for the Jewish people. They have been a major civilizing force in the world. Now, events of the creation of Jewish monotheism, again, around 2091, God calls Abram, later to become Abraham, and he begins the people of God. Around 1446, God calls Moses to lead the Israelites out of captivity, and I'm going to talk about that more this afternoon. Sounds like we have planes landing on the upper deck. And so he created the religion of Judaism, and then around 1010 BC, God calls the young David through the prophet Samuel to become the king of Israel and establishes the nation of Israel. There was a king before him, Saul, but he really messed up badly, so God removed him and replaced him with the young King David. These are the three main characters, as I said. Abraham, created the people of Israel. Moses, through God, used him to introduce the religion of Israel. David was the real centerpiece of the nation of Israel. And if you want to try to remember this, when I teach history, I never push dates. But roughly speaking, very roughly speaking, you can think 2,000, 1,500, and 1,000. Abraham, Moses, and David. That gives you a general idea. That's off a few years, but then these are only certain numbers anyway. This is the call to Moses in Exodus 19. Then Moses went up to God, to receive the law. And the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, although the whole world is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. Again, more than half the world's population are monotheists. Monotheism came through Judaism. It's obviously the Judeo-Christian link, but Judaism also was at the core of Islam, although they reinterpreted because Moses felt he was supposed to clean up the corruption. Still, the stories are very much the same. The stories in the Quran, while they may vary a little bit, they're interesting twists, like it's Ishmael that almost gets sacrificed instead of Isaac. Still, Judaism was at the core of all of that. And when God gave the message to first Moses and then other prophets, he created the Tanakh, which is the general name, common name for the Hebrew Bible, taken from the first 5 books, the section called the Torah, or instruction. Sometimes it's called law, but instruction's a better translation. The Nevi'im, which means prophets, from Joshua through the prophetic writings, and then the Ketuvim, or writings, which include Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, Song of Solomon, the wisdom writings, they're sometimes called. You take Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, and push them together, you get Tanakh. And that's what Jewish people call the Hebrew Bible. That's the common name for it. Basic Jewish beliefs. In the Hebrew Bible, there are 613 different commandments. They are called mitzvot. One of them is called a mitzvah. Mitzvot, 613 commandments. There are the top 10. These are the big 10. These are the ones that God gave to Moses on the tablets. Gave to him twice because when Moses came down from the mountain and saw that the Hebrew people were worshiping a golden calf idol, he broke them and then had to go back and get more. There's a funny scene. Do you remember Mel Brooks?
15.
He comes down and he's got 3 tablets and he's trying to carry these stone tablets, and he goes, God has given us 50, and he drops one of them and it breaks. He goes, 10. God has given us 10 commandments. Okay. That's Mel Brooks' interpretation. The 10 commandments, very simply, you shall have no other gods before God, one God. Now you'll notice it does not say there are no other gods. It says you will have no other God before God. This actually reflected the fact that for the Hebrew people and everybody before that, they believed in more than one God, but believed there was only one that truly should be worshipped. This is called henotheism, rather than monotheism. That there are multiple gods, but only one of them should be worshipped. And that's what's reflected in the first of the 10 commandments. Secondly, you shall not make or worship any idols. Third, you shall not take the name of God in vain. Because of this third one, the Hebrew people, when they're learning to read, when young boys are being taught for their bar mitzvah to read the Hebrew passages, they will not, if they come to the proper name of God, which is the tetragrammaton, it's called, Yahweh. This is the name that God told Moses was his proper name, because Moses said, if I go down to the Israelites and tell them you sent me, who do I tell them you are? What's your name? And he said, it's Yahweh. Yahweh is not to be pronounced for the danger that they might say it and use it in vain. Hebrew boys are taught never to say Yahweh. If they're reading through the Torah or the prophets, they come to the proper name Yahweh, they are supposed to replace it as they read with the word Adonai, which is a generic word which means Lord. Well, you've all heard the word Jehovah, right? You might be interested to know there is no such word as Jehovah. What happens is, in the Hebrew text, because Hebrew, like all ancient languages, was written without vowels. It's only consonants. Vowels are letters that help us understand how to pronounce things, but in written ancient languages, they didn't use them. But frequently, when they're teaching people how to read this, and they need to know how to pronounce it in Hebrew, they would put what's called vowel points in the margins, at the end of the lines. The vowel points, as you go along, they're in order, and like you come to a word, if you're not sure how to pronounce it, you look over in the margin, and those vowel points tell you how to insert the vowels, and this is how you would pronounce it. Because vowels are breathing sounds. A, I, O, U, you know, kind of A, E, I, O, U. Well, if you take the consonants from Yahweh, the proper name of God, and the vowel points from Adonai, which is the word they would insert, you get Jehovah. There actually is no such word. It's a pushing together of consonants from one word and vowels from another. Interesting, huh? It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. It's just interesting to know that. Number 4, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, doing no work on that day, because God created the universe in 6 days and rested on the Sabbath. That's the Sabbath day. Honor your father and your mother. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness against your neighbor, do not covet your neighbor's house or wife or manservant or maidservant or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. The 10 commandments, the top 10. Now, interestingly, these are broken up in 2 sets of 5. The first 5 are seen as requirements to God. This is our relationship with God, and you go, well, how's that honor your father and your mother? The Jews understood that God was the one who gave you your father and your mother to be earthly authorities, and that they were anointed by God to be the authorities over you, and therefore you should obey them and honor them. So in effect, that is honoring God, by honoring those that He put in authority. The last 5 are all ethical statements about how we are supposed to act toward one another. This is why, in these commandments, in various forms, obviously it's both Judaism and Christianity, but there are versions of this in Islam as well, and they consider the Hebrew Bible to be God's book, although they think it was corrupted in some ways. This is why the 3 great monotheistic religions are called ethical monotheisms. Other ancient religions did not have rules that said in order for you to properly follow belief in God, you had to act in a moral way. Simply didn't exist. It was invented by Judaism, in effect. That didn't mean that, you know, a mother would not say to a son, you need to be nicer to your brother. But there were not rules that were ethical rules that were associated with your worship of God until Judaism. And then that became a major characteristic of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, because of this ethical monotheism that comes in the 10 Commandments. There's another way to understand Judaism, and one of the great teachers of Judaism is Maimonides. He was a rabbi. He was actually Spanish. He ended up spending most of his life in Egypt. This is during the time when Spain was controlled by the Muslims, but he was widely regarded by both Jewish people and by Muslim people. He often is called Rambam because, again, the Jewish people have always been great about pushing words together. So Rabbi, what's his first name? Maimonides. Push that all together and you get Rambam. He listed 13 principles that are the basic beliefs of the Jewish faith, and these have pretty much universally been accepted since then. Some don't care as much for them, but generally, number 1, God exists and He is the creator. He made everything. Second, God is one and unique. There is none other like Him. This sounds very much like Islam. You remember the idea of shirk is the worst sin in Islam. That means comparing anything to God or trying to make it equal to God. There is none other like Him, Maimonides said. 3, God is not physical. God is spirit. 4, God is eternal. He has always been and will always be. 5, prayer is to be directed only to God. Don't pray to other things. Don't pray to other idols or other deities, other beings. Very much like you'll have no other God before me. 6, the words of the prophets are true. The first great prophet of the Hebrew faith was actually Moses, although Abraham's considered a prophet and some of the others in Islam. The words of the prophets are true. The prophecies of Moses are true. The Torah, the instruction, the law was given to Moses. There will be no other Torah. The canon, as it's called, C-A-N-O-N, which means the instruction given by God and written down. The canon of the Hebrew faith in the Torah, which is the most highly regarded of the Hebrew Bible. There will be no other Torah. Christianity believes there will be no other books added to the Bible either. Number 10, God knows the thoughts and deeds of all people. 11, God rewards the good and punishes the wicked. 12, the Messiah will come. Judaism believes in a Messiah. From the very start, and especially from the time of Moses on, they talked about the fact that another will come. It was the messianic expectation of Judaism that led to Jesus Christ and the belief that he was the Messiah, the fulfillment. And then 13, the dead will be resurrected. There is a sense of resurrection in the Jewish faith as well. These are the 13 principles of Maimonides. Within Judaism, or Rabbinic Judaism, since the 6th century, what happened during the 6th century, or the 580s, 586, Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, the Jewish people were taken off into captivity in Babylon, and they had to come up with a different way of doing Judaism. They didn't have the temple, or the sacrificial system of the temple. They weren't in the Promised Land. What were they to do? They decided that they developed the rabbinic principles. The synagogue became the center of the Jewish faith, as a place of prayer, of education, of fellowship, so that they could maintain their sense of identity. So everything since then is considered rabbinic Judaism, until the rebuilding of the temple, which may happen someday. Conservative Jewish people believe that it will. But we have Orthodox Judaism is the most conservative of Judaism. There is Reform Judaism, which is much more liberal. It believes that the principles are true, but you don't have to follow all of the little pieces of it. You don't have to follow all the instructions. Conservative Judaism is an effort to be in between the first two. It's a moderate between the very conservative and the very liberal. Hasidic or Hasidic Judaism actually came from Eastern Europe, and it's relatively modern, and it is an effort. In its day, it was a reform version of Judaism, but it's an effort to try to figure out how to be Jewish in the modern world, what you have to maintain absolutely, what you can give up. Reconstructionist Judaism, Jewish renewal, humanistic Judaism are various other small groups, levels. Humanistic Judaism is non-theistic. They don't believe in God. But they do believe that the principles, the ethical aspects of it, we should follow. Now, you need to understand in that regard that being Jewish, there's two aspects to being Jewish. You can be biologically Jewish, meaning you're descended from the Jewish people. You have Semitic roots. And then secondly, you can be Jewish as your faith, as your religious commitment, the way you obey God. Those two things are usually tied together, but not always. And so humanistic Judaism are Jews that recognize that they are Jewish, and they believe in the principles of ethical monotheism, but they don't believe even in God. All right? So there are various types of beliefs. And then there is Kabbalah, which is, you may know that Madonna is a big follower of Kabbalah. It is the mystical side. It's not a movement in itself. There are pieces of it in most of the other practices of Judaism, but it is the belief that there is a connection between the physical world and the spiritual world, and the effort to try to seek a synchronizing of those things. All right? None of that is very complete exposition, or we'd be here all day. Jewish dates leading up to the 1st century. Solomon dies, the kingdom is divided. Assyria destroys the northern kingdom of Israel. 586, Babylon destroys the southern kingdom of Judah, and the captivity happens, the Babylonian captivity. 536, King Cyrus of Persia lets the Jews return home. 332 BC, Alexander the Great conquers the Persian Empire and spreads the Greek language and culture. Now, again, if you remember your Sunday school lessons, or if you attend church, you may have heard about the Sadducees and the Pharisees in the New Testament, that Jesus was always feuding with one or both of those groups. Those two groups primarily, simplistically, but primarily you could say the Sadducees, which were the sort of ruling class, they were much more Greek or Hellenized. The ancient name for Greece is Hellas. So when you talk about Hellenized, it means Greek-like. The Sadducees spoke Greek. They liked the Greek culture. They wanted to be more Greek. The Pharisees were a reaction against that because they wanted to speak Hebrew. They wanted to keep the old traditions. And so Pharisees and Sadducees hated each other because they were on different sides of the cultural battle, more so than the theological battle. And then in 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey conquers the whole region for Rome. Interestingly enough, the Hasmonean Jews had asked the Romans to come and help in an internal civil war, and they came and helped all right. They took over everything. And then in 39 BC, the Roman Senate makes Herod the Great king of the Jews, And then 70 AD, the Jewish rebellion in Israel, Judea, and in Jerusalem especially, leads to the Romans destroying Jerusalem. This is the second great destruction. The first one by the Babylonians, the second one by the Romans in AD 70, and this is the second great diaspora. Diaspora means spreading out of the Jews. This image is actually from the Titus, the Arch of Titus in Rome, and you can see Roman soldiers carrying off all of the treasures in AD 70 from the temple in Jerusalem, including the great menorah and various other pieces. The diaspora in AD 70, when the Romans destroyed the city of Jerusalem, they traveled everywhere. They fled there and went all over the world. And so you find pockets of Jewish people literally all over the world now. I mentioned that there are a number of African tribes, some in India as well, that have always said they were descended from Jewish people. They have a language that sounds like Hebrew. Well, genetic testing is now available, and they're proving that many of those groups really are descended from Jewish people. They are descended from some of the lost and scattered tribes of Israel that were spread out either when the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom and you have the 10 lost tribes of Israel, or during the diasporas from the Romans. And then at other times, there was a time when Britain expelled all Jewish people from Britain. There was a time when Spain expelled all Jewish people from Spain. Well, they had to go somewhere. And we find them all over the world now, okay? Mark Twain said, "All things are mortal but the Jew, all other forces pass, but the Jew remains. What is the secret of his immortality?" Very famously, an advisor to an early ruler in the Middle East who was not Jewish, he asked his advisor one time, "Give me one absolute proof for the existence of God. One thing that will prove to me that God exists." And his advisor very quietly said, "The survival of the Jewish people." Because they have been the most persecuted people, all the way back to the book of Esther in the Hebrew Bible, where there was a campaign to try to annihilate the Jewish people, and it has happened over and over and over again, including obviously the Holocaust, the pogroms in Russia, etc. Yes?
The theory as to why the Jewish people are so...
Why are the Jewish people so persecuted? My own personal theory is that they are the people of God. And that as Christians, we have inherited that promise. We have been adopted. Paul says in the New Testament that those who believe through Jesus Christ are grafted onto the root stock, that is the Hebrew people. And so I believe there are forces that exist that want to do them harm, because I believe that the Old Testament stories are true. That's an aside, because I'm not meaning to preach. This is supposed to be historical, okay? And then from Jeremiah, Jacob, which is a shorthand term for the Jewish people, will again have peace and security, and no one will make them afraid. "I am with you and will save you, declares the Lord. Though I completely destroy all the nations among which I scatter you, I will not completely destroy you. I will discipline you, but only with justice. I will not let you go entirely unpunished." God has always chastised the Jewish people when they were not obedient, but He has never allowed them to be destroyed. Okay? Let's talk about Christianity for a minute. I'm spending more time on Judaism because Christianity, I think you probably know better. I'll talk about it a little bit. And Islam I covered mostly yesterday, so we're getting close here. Jesus, who was, his title is Christ. Again, as I said before, Christ is not his last name. I can remember as a kid people thinking that. Christ is from the Greek Christos, which means anointed. Kings, prophets were anointed, and priests, and he was all three. It is the same word as the Hebrew word Mashiach, from which we get Messiah. So Christ, Messiah, anointed, all mean the same thing, and it is the title. We believe that he was somewhere around, born sometime around 4 to 6 BC, lived sometime between 27 and 33 AD. And obviously the Christian Bible is both the Hebrew Bible in a slightly different order, but it's all the same content, with the addition of the New Testament, which are the books that record, the first 4 books are the Gospels, which record the story of Jesus' life on earth, the book of Acts, which talks about the growth of the early church, and then the letters. Paul, the apostle, wrote more of the letters than any other person. Basic Christian beliefs: one God, there exists one God. Sound familiar? These are all three monotheistic religions. He reveals himself, however, in three persons, the Holy Trinity. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. One unity, sharing one substance. And people get confused by that. There are a lot of metaphors people have used, like an egg. An egg is one egg, but it has three distinct parts. There's a shell, a white, and a yolk. The example that I use is me or you. I am one person, but I have a controlling mind. I have a spirit that responds to things that are not cognitive, things like love, trust, honor, those kinds of things. And then I have a physical body. I have three very distinct parts, and it's possible for my body to stop working, but my mind to still be alive, assuming they artificially maintain it, or the other way around, for my mind to stop working, but my body to still exist. I believe that, to me, is the best metaphor for how the Trinity is understood in Christianity. Second, God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and omnipresent, meaning he's everywhere at once. He created the world as distinct from himself, but is active within it as creator, sustainer, and sanctifier. Third, Jesus was and is the promised Messiah, the co-eternal divine Son of God who became a human man, Jesus, but was fully God and fully man. Not 50-50, not 80-20. This is the great paradox. He was 100% God, 100% human. And in being that, the Christian belief is, he linked together the divinity of God and humanity and made it possible for that relationship to exist. And then fourth, no one can earn God's mercy or become truly righteous, but one can receive forgiveness and mercy by accepting Jesus as God's Son, who sacrificed himself on the cross to atone for human sins. This is not an effort on my part to preach. These are the basic beliefs of Christianity, the second of the great monotheisms. By AD 70, within 40 years or so of Jesus' death, all of these areas had become Christian. The islands in the Mediterranean, almost all of Asia Minor, into Europe, the various parts of Greece, Rome, North Africa. And that's within 40 years, with no email, no telephones, no jets, no trains or automobiles. By 565, that is within a little over 500 years, Christianity had taken over most of Europe and North Africa, including Egypt. So the green line is the Byzantine Christian outline of the empire. So it was well outside the Eastern Roman religion. Today, Christianity is represented by Roman Catholicism. In Rome, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, is the head of the Roman Catholic Church. It is Latin in its origin and Western. Then there is Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy, in the 11th century, there was a huge split between the Latin-speaking Western church centered in Rome and the Greek-speaking Eastern churches with their center in Constantinople, now Istanbul. And that's called the Great Schism. Within Orthodoxy, there are several groups: Eastern Orthodoxy, which is Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, and then other smaller groups that call themselves Oriental Orthodox, Ethiopian Orthodox, etc. Then Protestantism in the 16th century, the Great Reformation, starting with Martin Luther, and then later with Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland, and with John Calvin in Switzerland. So within Protestantism in the 16th century, they split off from the Catholic Church, and they primarily are four types: Lutheran, Reformed, which is Presbyterian, following the theology as articulated by John Calvin, Anglican, and Anabaptist. If you have questions about those things, come and see me later. Let's talk for a few minutes about Islam, but not much because we talked about this yesterday. Muhammad came along in 570. In 610, he began to receive the revelation, that is the Quran. The growth of Islam from the time, the dark orange, from the time of Muhammad, the lighter orange during the first four caliphs or successors, the Rashidun, rightly guided caliphs, and then later on the Umayyads covered all of this area, so that it became, at its height, at that time, the largest empire in the history of the world. Later on, it was exceeded by Great Britain, by the Mongol Empire, etc. But at that time, it was the largest empire in the world. Basic beliefs. Muslim life, as I said yesterday, is more about orthopraxy, that is right practice, than it is about orthodoxy or right belief. It is based on the writings of the Quran, which means recite. That's what the angel Gabriel or Jibril said to Muhammad. And it is still considered more valid when it is being recited than when it's being read on document. The Sunnah, which are the life examples of Muhammad and his companions, and the Hadith, which are the sayings of Muhammad and his companions. And one of the reasons you get many different interpretations is while the Quran is one thing, the Sunnahs and the Hadiths, there are multiple ones of those, and not all groups accept the same ones. The revelation of Muhammad was in Arabic, which is considered the holy language. Quite literally, Muslims believe that God speaks Arabic, and that the Quran and the religion of Islam must be conducted in Arabic. Islam means submission to Allah and His will. A Muslim, which is from the same root as Islam, means one who does submit. We talked about the 5 pillars of Islam, the profession of faith, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is His prophet. 5 times a day prayer facing toward Mecca. Generous almsgiving or zakat, fasting during the month of Ramadan, and the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, at least once in a person's life. This is a different image of the crowds in Mecca, in the great mosque at Mecca, around the Kaaba. That's the black thing. The black is actually fabric. It's cloth. It's gold embedded cloth, and they renew that regularly. And it's hollow inside. But this is the event. One of the major events of the Hajj is to walk around the Kaaba. Similarities and differences between these 3 Abrahamic religions. All 3 Abrahamic faiths believe there is only one God, so they are monotheistic. Secondly, they believe that all life, especially all people, are made by God, who is the creator and sustainer of life. Judaism, Christianity, Islam all believe that. They also believe, because they are ethical monotheisms, social justice and concern for others is critical. So they share those beliefs. Ways in which they differ or disagree are one in the exact nature of God, particularly the Christian's idea of the Trinity, that God, while He is one God, He exists in 3 persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That is not acceptable to conservative Jews or to Muslims. Second, the nature of the human condition, the idea of, what is our situation. Christianity especially maintains that we are, because of the fall, inherently sinful, and that sin has to be dealt with before we can be back in relationship with God. Islam does not assume that. They assume that you sort of start with a zero slate, and then where do you go from there? Do you do good or you do evil? Third, they believe the nature of the afterlife or salvation, what is required for that. Islam, and to a great extent Judaism, believe that it is how you conduct your life. If you are obedient to God, if you worship Him, if you conduct your life the way you're supposed to, then you will be accepted. Whereas in Christianity, it is less about what you do, although there are rules about how you should act, than about what you believe. And then fourth, the requirements for pleasing and satisfying God. What is required? They have different expectations. So these are the way in which these 3 great monotheisms agree and disagree. I'll put that up there. Are there any questions from any of this? Yes?
I just have one, and this may not be the appropriate time for it, but would it be appropriate to ask for a little brief explanation of the concept of Jewish exceptionalism? Or would that be better suited elsewhere?
Yeah, let's talk about that. That's good. The idea of Jewish exceptionalism. We can discuss that personally, but I don't want to get into too much detail. I mean, yes?
The Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, the outside wall is considered sacred by the Jews.
Right.
And yet inside that wall there is there's the other religions.
Right, Islam.
Islam, yeah.
Right.
Who is supposedly buried behind there?
So the issue is, in Jerusalem, there is the Western Wall. It used to be called the Wailing Wall. They don't use that anymore. But the Western Wall is the last remaining part of the original temple complex from Judaism. This is the only piece that was left after it was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. And there actually were 2 different temples. There was the original Solomonic temple, which was destroyed by the Babylonians, and then later on, Herod the Great rebuilt the temple. He actually fixed up the temple that Ezra and Nehemiah had built, which was pretty, even the scripture says, was pretty lame. And then he made it great again. So The Western Wall in Jerusalem is the only part that still exists. Well, after Islam took over all of the region, and they took the Temple Mount, it's called, which is this large flat sort of mini plateau there. It's the highest point in Jerusalem. And they built 2 mosques there. There is the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They are considered among the holiest places. Probably Jerusalem is a holy city to all 3 of the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In Islam, we were talking about this the other day with someone. If you go in the Dome of the Rock, or if you did, you can't now, nobody's allowed in there because there have been terrorist attacks and violence and all sorts of things. No one who's not Muslim is allowed on the main part of the Temple Mount now. You can only be around the outside. If you went in there, there's this huge rock. That's why it's called the Dome of the Rock. It's right in the middle. And on that rock, there is what looks like a horseshoe print. The part of Islam's belief is that Muhammad was miraculous. He was given this miraculous steed, mostly a horse, but it was a little different than just an ordinary horse, that carried him from Mecca all the way to Jerusalem, and that steed then launched off of the rock that is now in the Dome of the Rock and launched him into heaven, and he experienced revelations in heaven and then came back and landed there again, and that's why you have that footprint on the stone. And that's the Dome of the Rock. So it's because the Muslims had conquered all of the Middle East and they had controlled that area. It is a basic principle of all those faiths. You don't destroy somebody else's place of worship. And so even the most conservative Jews do not believe that they should try by violence to take over the Temple Mount again, destroy the 2 mosques that are there, and rebuild the temple. There are some ultra-conservative Jewish people who believe the temple will be rebuilt, but they assume that a great earthquake or some other natural disaster will destroy those mosques, and they then can rebuild the temple. So that's why you have the Western Wall, the last part of the second temple, destroyed in AD 70, and then behind that, you've got an Islamic area with 2 mosques in it. Does that answer your question? Yes?
Is Chapala a town in Mexico where you live?
Yes, it is. It's a town, it's also an area, so they refer to the Chapala area. It's Lake Chapala is the lake that we live on. It's the biggest lake in Mexico. Other questions? Yes?
Christianity has sent missionaries to spread the word and to do good works. Has Islam done any of the same?
Well, the question is, Christianity sends out missionaries. Has Islam done the same? They have, but not in the same way. The reason is because while in Christianity, evangelism is seen as a particular gift, and so certain people feel called to evangelize. Actually, Christianity would say that everybody has a responsibility to be a witness. Islam assumes that everyone who is Muslim has a responsibility to try to share the faith. Now, they don't have a responsibility to convert people, but they do have a responsibility to share their faith. Some Muslims are reluctant to explain the details of Islam because they believe if you know enough about Islam and decide not to accept it, then you can be condemned. If you don't know, then you're not going to be held responsible. And so some Muslims don't want to get into the details of sharing that. But within Islam, all people are supposed to bear witness to Allah, rather than have certain people that are supposed to be missionaries. So they don't have a missionary movement in the way that Christianity often has. Okay? Yes?
You said previously that Muhammad received the Quran to kind of improve or eliminate the corruption of the Christian faith. Was that mainly the Trinity concept, or what other corruption did you feel was going on?
So what corruption was it that Muhammad was sent to correct in Judaism and Christianity? The Trinity was part of it, because they do not believe, and that's why one of the major principles is the unity of God, the Tawheed of God, Allah. But there are other parts of it, like the stories they think got corrupted, that it wasn't Isaac that was the focus, it was Ishmael. They believe the focus should have been on Hagar, not on Sarah. And various other things like that, that they believe the stories got corrupted. Well, obviously, Jews and Christians look at it and say, I think you guys got it wrong later. The Quran, and I'm not meaning to be critical, but just as the kind of assessment, the Quran identifies the Trinity. It talks about the Trinity that Christians believe in, but does not accept it, rejects it. But it identifies the Trinity as being the Father, the Son, and the Mother. It believed that Mary was the third person of the Trinity. At least that's what's recorded in the Quran. And clearly that's not part of the Christian faith. But there are a lot of pieces of it, but the Trinity was one of those things that they didn't agree with in terms of that interpretation. Here first. Yeah, and then I'll come back over here. Okay? Yes?
In the three faiths, how do they differ in their belief about Jesus?
How do they differ in their belief about Jesus? The Jews would not accept Jesus as having a significant place at all. They think, if anything, he was a corrupter. And again, not all Jews. The vast majority of Jews are not religious in their practice. Okay, they are more secular. The vast majority of Jewish people today, they're very, very small percentages are actually serious about all of that stuff. But they would not accept Jesus in any way. Jesus is actually seen as a prophet, and a major prophet in Islam. And they believe, and it's recorded in the Quran, that he was born of a virgin. So they believe all that part is true, and they believe he was a great man of God, but that he was a man of God. And that no one can ever be the son of God, because that violates the most important principle of comparing nothing to God or not relating God as being part of something else. So they accept him as a prophet, but not as divine. And of course, Christianity sees him as God incarnate. Back over here? Yes, here first, and then you.
All these books, like all these religions, they have books. Quran, Bible, whatever.
Right.
How true there are this?
So, all these religions have books. How true are they? Well, that depends on who you ask.
There are a lot more than that.
Well,
books was written all these years.
The world religions, almost all of them have written books. Pretty much all of them. There are smaller religions that have books. Most of the smaller religions in the world don't have books. In fact, one of the things that characterizes religions that lasted and grew were, did they have a written foundation, like the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, the Quran, etc. When you ask, are they true? Well, that depends on who you ask.
Who write? Who wrote these books?
Well, different people. So there's not one simple answer to that. I mean, we could go through the list, but yes.
Could you compare the Leviticus with the Islamic religion? Because similar between the two.
Could I compare Leviticus to the Islamic religion? How? If I had 3 weeks. Leviticus is the book that gives the ritual requirements of the Jewish faith. It is the book that lays out the sacrificial system, the purity requirements, and all of that kind of thing. And there are similar kinds of things in Islam. I really can't go through and do a point-by-point comparison. That's way too complicated for me to do. But they are similar. I mean, there are parts of the Quran and of other parts of Islam that would address the same issues of purity and sacrifice, etc. But so there, and as I said yesterday, I think almost all human societies have certain things that they believed in. There's never been a human society that didn't have some kind of religion. There has never been a human society that has not proposed that there is something wrong with us, that human beings are in some way fundamentally broken. Whether we can figure that out or not, and we would say that that's why so many people spend their whole life trying to scratch whatever that itch is inside by getting power or getting wealth or getting a third house or a fifth car or whatever. And so most religions have agreed. Most religions have agreed that the need to find greater purity in your life, whether that be through ritual, through meditation, through obedience, or whatever it is. There are a lot of things like that that are consistent throughout all human cultures and societies, and so of course are reflected in multiple religions. Is that fair? Here first and then there. Sorry, yes?
I always understood that the Bible was the result of an oral tradition that evolved.
Okay, the Bible was the result of an oral tradition. Not exactly. The Bible was written. The Talmud in the Jewish faith is the oral law. And amongst the Jews, it is almost as important as the written Tanakh. The oral tradition of the Talmud, and it's in two major parts, the Mishnah and the Gemara, there's over 6,000 pages of the Talmud. And what happened was, it was oral tradition. It's sort of commentary on the Jewish faith and on the Jewish scripture. And for a long, long time, up until the start of the rabbinic period, it was only oral. And then finally they said, hey, it's a possibility. Everybody who has memorized this stuff could die, so we've got to write it down. And so it didn't get written down until after the time of Christ. Okay, so all of the Talmud was then recorded. We have it written, and it's considered. Some Jews would probably consider it as important as the Tanakh. All of them probably, if they're serious about their faith, would say that it is important. Now, the New Testament Bible, those books were written down. What happened there is that most of the Christians believed that Jesus was going to come back Tuesday. Okay, what time is it? When's he getting here? Because they thought he was going to return right away. After 30 or 40 years, I believe all of the New Testament books were written in the first century. And they were written by the people they're purported to have been written by. But after a number of years, they thought their first priority, since Jesus is going to come back soon, is to get out there and tell people, get the word out. And that's why it grew so fast by AD 70. Finally, they realized that people started dying off who had experienced the resurrected Christ. And they said, we better write this down in case more of us die before he comes back. And that's why the books were not written immediately, but still written within the lives of the people who are purported to write them. Now, not all scholars agree with that. More and more scholars are beginning to go back and say the evidence suggests that the last book of the New Testament, which is the book of Revelation, was written by John the Apostle, who was the youngest apostle, who lived to almost the age 100, and he wrote it late in the first century, so before 100. That's what I believe, from a scholarly point of view, not just a faith point of view. Okay? One last question. Okay, and there they sat stunned for some moments. Go ahead.
The term Allah.
Allah.
Came from what?
Allah is an Arabic word which means the God. It means God, but it has built into it a singularity. It's not a God, it's the God.
And
So,
is it believed to be the same God of the Jewish and Christian?
is it believed to be the same God as Judaism and Christianity? Again, it depends on who you ask, because some of these things are faith issues, or faith questions. Some Muslims would say it is the same God corrected. They have fixed the problems. Most Jews and Christians who have studied it at all, I mean, obviously there are people who are serious and study these things, and then there are people for whom it's just a more casual relationship with their faith. People with a more casual relationship would say, well, it's all the same God, most likely. People who are serious about their theology and their faith, when they look at it, there are pretty fundamental differences between how God is described in the Judeo-Christian tradition, Yahweh, and how he's described as Allah. Allah is not seen as personal. He is not seen as one you can directly relate to, other than being obedient to, etc. And so there are, from my perspective as a Christian, I think there are such fundamental differences that I would not associate Allah as being the same as the Judeo-Christian God. But people differ on that. That doesn't mean that I challenge the right of Muslims to believe in Allah. We all have, you have a right to swing your fist as far as the end of somebody else's nose. I believe we have a right to our own faith system, and yet we all have to decide what we believe is true and what not. Where do we plant our flag? And I've studied Islam. I hope that's obvious. I've studied Judaism. I've studied world religions. I lecture on all the world religions, and I plant my flag in Christianity, which I believe to be the most right. Okay? Thank you all very much.